panel discussion, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce my friend and colleague, Rock Mackey, who will speak to us today about trending issues with radiation protection for external beam radiation oncology. Now, after Rock's talk, we'll have to have a few minutes while we transform the platform into a panel discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. I love Sweden and Stockholm especially. I have a daughter-in-law who's Swedish, who lives in Los Angeles, so it's a pleasure to be in her home country. I do have to disclose that I do have potential conflicts of interest in two companies related to the content of the talk. So medical radiation exposure is increasing, and that's because of access as well as utilization. Modern radiation therapy is really devoted to decreasing the acute exposure, the deterministic effects, to sensitive tissue, using 3D conformal and intensity modulated radiation therapy, IMRT, which, by the way, I think was invented by Anders Brahma, who spoke at the end of the morning. Talk a little bit about protons versus X-ray beams. And image guidance in radiotherapy really does allow us to shrink the margins and utilize much smaller fields and much less integral dose at the expense of extra dose from the imaging procedure. An integral dose really is, I think, a simple measure of patient harm. It's very easy to calculate, and it's very useful for the radiation oncologists. Talk a little bit about the types of photon beam therapy. We've really gone through a renaissance in the last 20 years or so, and it's in fact increasing of the variety of delivery. Talk about the emergence of magnetic resonance image guided radiotherapy, which doesn't compromise with extra dose to the patient to guide the treatment at the expense of a more expensive machine. And talk in general about the reduction in radiation bunker size, which affects cost and also is directly relevant to radiation protection. So as you know, much of the world's increasing due to the access to radiation medicine. And that's a good thing, okay? But it does mean that we are potentially then will have more secondary cancers. We know that. And we also know in the developed world, this happens to be the US, it's much higher than the world average. And a lot of this exposure in the US is due to the increase in CT, especially, somewhat also due to the radiation therapy. I want to start out by really showing what you can do with intensity modulated radiation therapy and proton radiation therapy. And so this was a study that we did a number of years ago in which we have a phantom, a simulated phantom, and we call it a dose contrast resolution phantom because we were either increasing the amount of contrast of dose that you would want to deliver to the clinical target volume as a boost or a second CTV boost, either higher dose or an avoidance structure at lower dose, so that you could then have differential dose that's embedded in the clinical target volume. And then, of course, there's normal tissue surrounding that in which you would say there is no dose. And so if you look at intensity modulated radiation therapy, it's the so-called step and shoot IMRT, it does a pretty good job if you're not trying to either avoid dose in these regions or add dose to these regions. But as you start to get to a higher boost, you can achieve better performance with rotational IMRT. And here you really are spreading the dose that's being delivered, the unwanted dose that's being delivered on the entrance and exit to a larger amount of normal tissue, as you can see here, as compared to here. And proton radiation therapy can be delivered in the same style, although it's not done today. Rotational IMPT, or intensity modulated proton therapy, can be in fact delivered to get exquisite as well ability to either avoid or add a boost to a smaller structure with a whole lot less unwanted dose. Here, the beams are coming from 180 degrees in this direction, none of them in this direction, and so essentially there's very little dose, some neutron dose there, because there's no exit dose from the protons. And so you can see very clearly here that protons deliver less than a factor of 2 less dose to X-ray as compared to X-rays. The number of proton centers is increasing in the developed world. In the US, there's a very rapid expansion, but actually, smaller than actually in Europe. Europe actually has more proton beams per capita than the United States. So that's a good thing. In generally, we are going to a system that is providing less unwanted dose to the patient, but at the expense of a very expensive modality, on the order of 5 to 10 times the construction costs if you view it as constructing a new clinic, and up to 50% or 100% operating costs higher for protons. So this is in classical radiation therapy for IMRT versus protons. If you go and look at the volume that has 1%, this is one gray, and compare protons to IMRT, you see that there's in the low dose part here, the high volume but low dose part, it's much better. As you start to get closer to the high dose region, this was actually for 50 gray treatment, then of course there should be equality between protons and photons. But you can see that all of this extra volume is being avoided by the proton radiotherapy. Let's talk about the process of external beam radiation therapy. It's not your father's radiation anymore. In the old days, what you did is you essentially use planar films. So you're doing 2D imaging to determine what your treatment fields were. And you could only really see the treatment volume through the bony anatomy. And the targeting was all done based on the bony anatomy. CT revolutionized that. CT allowed you to see soft tissue structures. And of course, most tumors are soft tissue structures. And so the advent of CT has made a revolution to radiation therapy in the last 40 years. And today that revolution is increasing because one of the processes that is increasingly being used is the use of imaging during treatment. I developed a system that was the first to do this. It used the megavoltage beam itself, lowered in energy from 6 MV to about 3 MV to acquire a megavoltage CT scan of the patient. And here you see then a megavoltage CT scan. This is the diagnostic CT scan. You can see it's much more noisy because megavoltage is very noisy. But this is only about 10 millisieverts, which is almost the same as the dose here. And you can see in this particular case, when this patient had the CT sim to plan the radiation therapy, there was a lot of gas in the rectum. And so clearly there's going to be a systematic error because most of the time there's probably not as much gas in the rectum as this patient presented. So having C at the time of treatment allows you then to set up and treat the prostate. So here's what you see in the blue is the megavoltage. Here is the diagnostic. And you can see that the therapist had to move the patient upwards. And so here you see the skin, where the skin is to achieve the same delivery to the prostate. And so this could be done automatically. It was tweaked a little bit then with a manual process. And then the offsets are done and the dose delivered. And this system actually allowed you then to see the planning target volume at the time of irradiation, as well as the isodose that would actually be achieved. So you see it's very sophisticated, good avoidance of the structures around the prostate in this particular case, And if we show other examples of rotational IMRT, you can see very fancy things like total scalp irradiation. You can treat very complicated head and neck regions. You can treat the breasts and even the lymph nodes around the lung, and total marrow irradiation. Total body irradiation delivered a lot of unwanted dose to the whole body, and you really only had to treat the marrow. And so it's possible then to shrink the volumes even in a highly complicated way. All right, let's take another look at prostate, for example. One of the things that the ICRU did is it promulgated the way in which you actually defined the target volume. So the planning target volume is what you have to treat around what you can see as the gross tumor volume here. So you needed to treat this, and the margin was because you have some uncertainty in setup, and you have some uncertainty in contouring by the physician. And then you have a rectal wall, so you don't have to contour the rectum, but you have to contour the rectal wall. And we also said, as one of the speakers said today, to highlight what the residual volume irradiated was. And you do that by determining the non-tumor tissue, which is the patient outline minus these structures. Okay, so that's what it's possible to do today in a conventional planning system, is to get the information that you would need to see what the residual dose volume histogram was for these structures. And so a dose volume histogram is such a plot. So what you do is you plot the dose in this axis, and this is 75 gray in this particular case for prostate. This is the relative volume normalized to at least this given dose. And so you read this off here as the planning target volume ideally should be it should have a line that runs here and then goes straight down. In other words, all of the volume is receiving the planned dose. Actually, the prescription here was 70 gray. And then the normal tissue structures then, this is the penile bulb, this is the rectal wall, and this is the non-tumor tissue. So you can see that a very large amount of volume is irradiated to a very low dose. And this is in the plane of the beam. We don't know actually what the scatter dose was to the rest of the patient, because in radiation therapy, you only do a scan from slightly outside the beginning of the target volume to a portion on the outside. If you were to get the whole CT, of course, then in principle you could get the non-tumor tissue everywhere. And I think it's becoming prudent to do that, because at an extra 10 millisieverts, then on a typical CT, you could estimate the dose to the whole patient. So the area under the curve is the integral dose to the structure. So one of the nice things about this plot, it's useful for the physician in planning to see if this is homogeneous and see if you have reasonable avoidance here. But the area under the curve is the integral dose to the structure. And the interesting thing, I'll show you that the integral dose to the patients is nearly invariant with the technique of delivery for photon beams. And if you pick units of gray liter, in other words, literally the integral of dose by volume, the structure is also equal to the product of the mean dose and the volume of the structure. So this is another way of getting the mean dose. By the way, the median dose can be just picked off by looking at the 50% dose value or volume value. So note that the definition of integral dose is probably better than energy. So in other words, if you were to integrate over the mass of the patient, then you get the energy absorbed by that tissue structure. But doing that really reduces the impact of low density structures like lung, and lung is known to likely be more sensitive, and so that is not done. And it raises the impact of high density tissues like bone, which probably is sensitive as well, but more sensitive than, for example, muscle as well. The components of integral dose in radiation therapy is the in-field dose including electron contamination. So a good radiation therapy treatment planning system can also calculate what the electrons streaming in from the machine, because there's photons coming from the machine and there's electrons that have been generated by the beam in air and by components that the beam is going through in air. The outside field leakage radiation, because the collimation isn't perfect. And then, as we saw in the last talk, neutron contamination from high energy beams, if you're using high energy beams. And just if we look at a first order effect, it's good to start looking at first order, and we'll zero in on this later. To first order, if you compare a parallel opposed pair, so two beams coming towards each other, and if you assume that you're going to avoid, forget about the buildup effect, and you're going to avoid the fact that there's attenuation, you essentially have a column of uniform dose. So the entrance dose from one beam plus the exit dose from the other is almost equal to the dose to the tumor. In a so-called four-field box, then you're still getting 100% of dose to the center of the box, but now you're doubling the volume at roughly half the dose. And so the invariance of the technique is shown here in this very simple example. And a very primitive form of intensity modulated radiation therapy is the use of a wedge. Wedges were used to actually produce a near linear gradient across the treatment field. And here you see that it balances out, that you have some parts that are less than 50%, some parts that are more than 50%, as compared to that four-field example. So there's really an invariance if you assume that the collimation is perfect and there's no radiation that is coming through the machine, leakage radiation from the machine. And we'll talk about the leakage radiation at the end. But IMRT intrinsically doesn't increase the integral dose. It's nearly invariant. In fact, it's possible to make it slightly less than conventional radiation therapy if you apply optimization, which you are forced to do to take into account how the beam should be modulated. So if we look at the radiobiology of integral dose, you tend to deliver less dose to a larger volume. So it's really a comparison of less dose to more volume, or a smaller volume at a higher dose. So in terms of deterministic effects, in general, a low dose to the normal tissue structure, even if it's a larger volume, is better than delivering a high dose to the normal tissue structure. Hence, IMRT is able to reduce deterministic effects in general. You have more power because you know that there's some structures like the thyroid and the breast that can be put as avoidance structures, and their dose then can be reduced to that from leakage radiation or scatter from the field. But there is this low dose bath that's produced well away from the tumor volume, at least in the region at which the tumor is. Away from that volume, there really isn't any more scattered dose. The scatter is almost invariant from the same amount of integral dose delivered to the target volume. Again, if leakage is low. But in fact, we'll see that radiation therapy, IMRT, wasn't really developed specifically to deliver IMRT, and so machines aren't quite able to have as low a leakage as you'd like. So if you look at a conventional multi-leaf collimator, it's about 6 or 7 centimeters high, and the leakage through them is on the order of a % or so. And so they're not doing a particularly good job of blocking the radiation. In fact, not even as well as if you were to make the classical molded Cerebund blocks that were used for 3D conformal. In a binary collimator that we developed for tomotherapy, we just increased the leaf thickness to 10 centimeters of tungsten, getting us down to about 0.5%. So being able to design a machine to do a particular thing like rotational IMRT you should think of the radiation protection from the ground up. So I've said that. So the classical LINAC today is a so-called C-arm gantry, and I show here one from Elekta, the local. I feel like the most favorite Swedish, or one of the largest Swedish companies, certainly in the field of radiation oncology. They happen to build these units in England, but it is a Swedish company. And I just show a picture of David Jaffrey, who at a relatively small clinic in the U.S. developed so-called cone beam CT, which put CT scanners right onto conventional cone beam CT. So I innovated a thing called tomotherapy, which was really the first marriage of a CT scanner intimately into the beam delivery system. So it pioneered daily CT-guided radiotherapy, intensely modulated rotational therapy, using essentially the same paradigm as helical CT. This allowed you to have very long treatment volumes, so you could treat, for example, total marrow radiation or cranial spinal fields in kids and young adults. But we had much thicker primary collimation, because in intensity modulation, you have more beam actually getting created from the target for IMRT. By definition, you are having to shield the valleys of the dose of the intensity distribution, and so that does require more, quote, monitor units and more radiation produced from the machine. So we incorporated then a lot more primary shielding, and you should always shield at the source, and a much thicker multi-leaf collimator. So interestingly, this paradigm has been followed by the largest radiotherapy company in the world, Varian. The Halcyon is a beam that, or is a system that's not a C-arm gantry. It's enclosed like a ring gantry. It looks like a CT scanner. It was designed specifically, like tomotherapy was, to do rotational IMRT. And they employ, built into it, even though you can't see it, a KV cone beam system if you buy it today. It does have a slower rotation speed than tomotherapy. That really doesn't matter in terms of the treatment delivery, because they have a higher dose rate delivered by the machine. But it doesn't have a slip ring, so it means you can't do extended fields. You couldn't do, for example, total marrow radiation very conveniently. But interestingly, it's the fastest selling Varian product ever. It's selling like hotcakes, as they say in America. Another very interesting machine that is getting to be quite common is the CyberKnife. It's essentially an industrial robot holding a linear accelerator and a collimation system. Interestingly, this entire system only weighs about 400 pounds, so it's relatively light as compared to other forms of radiation therapy. It's really designed for stereotactic radiosurgery, and this system can deliver then small-shaped fields, but relatively limited in treatment volume to be delivered. Originally designed for brain, but it's extended for treatment of the spine and even lung and prostate radiation therapy. And what they pioneered is really the treatment, so-called hypofractionation. So instead of treating over, say, 7 or 8 weeks for a prostate radiation therapy, patients are treated over 1 week. So what does this mean? Well, it means that you can't deliver as much total dose to the patient, right? The doses are a lot less, but they're delivered a lot faster. And so much higher dose per fractionation, but over a short time. And it turns out for prostate, that's probably a good thing. The radiation biology, as Jack Fowler showed specifically for prostate, and David Brenner confirmed it, is better for prostate, delivering a higher dose per fraction. Well, what does this mean? It means that there's total less unwanted dose to the patient and to staff as well. And they're being followed by other radiotherapy systems. They're delivering so-called hyperfractionation. And they also have a dual, but now real-time fluoroscopy, so that they can do gating, and so on. So if we look at one of these studies that compares external beam techniques, and this was fairly broad. It was proton, stereotactic radiosurgery, 3D conformal, conventional IMRT, and helical tomotherapy for several different brain tumors. So this study was done in London, Ontario. And it really showed that if you look at these techniques, there's not much integral dose difference. This is the mean dose to brain. And remember, in terms of the dose to the brain, integral dose is the volume times the mean dose. So mean dose is proportional to integral dose. There's essentially then the same integral dose for photons, but for protons, it's reduced by around a factor of 3. And so, proton radiation therapy really can reduce the mean dose to the brain, the normal brain, and as well which is really the same as the integral dose. If we go and look at a prostate example, I'm going to prove a different point here, and looking at more conventional pre-IMRT 6 MV 3D conformal versus a 20 MV. In prostate cancer, it was felt that you needed to have high energy beams, and of course high energy beams can be delivered by a classical LINAC because you also felt that you need to have the capabilities to use electron beams. And electron beams really aren't useful unless they're above about 10 MV. And it's very typical to have 15 MV electron beams or 20 MeV electron beams. And so why not then have high energy photon beams? And I'll show that, at least for IMRT, there's really no advantage to having a high energy beam. And in fact, it's only a detriment. And then tomotherapy is another example. So here's the 5 examples here. This happens to be the 3D conformal. This is the 3D IMRT. This is the 20 MeV 3D conformal, the 20 MeV IMRT, and the tomotherapy or rotational therapy is much different. It has a much different kind of look. So the other thing you have to factor in is in the total unwanted dose is the leakage photons, as I mentioned, and the neutrons. And it's going to depend on how far you are away from the field. This is the leakage photons at 10 centimeters away from a field, and neutrons and the neutron dose, and at 20 centimeters and the neutron dose. You also have to look at the leaf leakage here, and here's some conventional C-arm gantries. Again, they were originally the collimators, and these systems were built to do 3D conformal. They weren't built for IMRT. Siemens built a system that had thicker leaves by another centimeter of tungsten, and then tomotherapy added 2 more centimeters of tungsten. And so you can see it's possible to reduce the leaf leakage a lot, and this can be important. And then the peripheral dose, this is the dose that's entirely due to leakage, and so this is. See, I think we have the energy listed here. Yeah, it's 18 MV. It's 18 megavolts here, as compared to a 6 MV beam, which I plotted on top of here, as well as tomotherapy. So, and this is a log linear graph, and so it's about a factor of 10 reduction if you put in much thicker primary collimators. And so, on the tomotherapy machine, there was 23 centimeters of tungsten in the forward direction. And of course, it had to be thick in the forward direction because bremsstrahlung comes out the forward direction, and it was much thinner at the back. But adding this, it's a bit costly, $10,000 or so for that much tungsten machined, makes a big difference. So if we then go and look at this comparison, 6 MV 3D conformal. Versus IMRT, 20 MV 3D conformal versus IMRT, then you can see, if we go and just look at the 6 MV as compared to 20 MV 3D conformal, that's why people use 20 MeV for conventional 3D CRT, because you could get a 6% reduction in the integral dose. And in fact, this case, you can see that I said it's invariant. Well, in fact, this is somewhat higher. And why is it higher? Well, it's higher because the beam was on longer, and the machine wasn't really designed to reduce the leakage outside the field. And so this then increased the dose, or the integral dose to the patient. But the 20 MV IMRT was greater than the 6 MV 3D conformal. And why is that? Well, it was because of the neutron component. Because this beam produces neutrons, whereas 6 MV doesn't. And then if you add the extra shielding, then you can be somewhat better than the 6 MV 3D conformal. But really, another story here is that it only varies by, at most, 8%, okay, whatever you do. So integral dose really is almost invariant. It really depends a lot more on the volume that you're irradiating, the size of the target volume, the thickness of the patient. And by the way, if a patient's a lot bigger, right, if they're fat like me, then there's a longer path length through the patient than a thin patient, so it depends on the patient as well. But I think this tells us that there really isn't much advantage to a high-energy beam, especially if you don't use electrons very often. And modern radiotherapy really doesn't use electrons very often. In fact, it's been shown that IMRT photons can deliver exquisite dose distributions to the surface, like total scalp irradiation, and do a much better job than an electron beam. So there's not really any necessity to have a high-energy beam anymore. You can get by, like Halcyon, for example, or tomotherapy, with 6 MV beam. And another reason for that is at high energies, yes, you get deeper buildup, which reduces integral dose, but there's a higher exit dose. And another big factor is that you have to make the margins larger to accommodate the penumbra, because electrons are produced by a high energy beam that go longer distance laterally, and so the penumbra is greater, right? So this greater penumbra then means that you're going to have greater integral dose for a high energy beam. It's a small effect, but it's noticeable. And of course, then there's no neutron dose for a low energy beam. Under 10 MV, there's very little, and there's none at 6. So the reasons to get a high energy beam are diminishing. And this was stated even much earlier by a paper by Ken Case, who I know the radiation protection people know well, and Indra Das. The image-guided aspect of modern radiotherapy does mean that you're giving CT or, at minimum, a fluoroscopy dose to the patient if you want to have exquisite ability to deliver highly conformal radiotherapy. And an MR system or two types of MR systems are being developed or have been developed. The ViewRay, which has a 0.35 Tesla magnet. The image quality is not quite as good as you'd have in a 1.5 T. The beam actually goes between the magnets, so you don't have as much scatter as you'll see in the Elekta version of MR guided radiotherapy. And you can do real-time imaging. You can actually gate the beam. You can see and modify the delivery on the fly automatically. It has this gating motion management such that the beam's only on when the target volume's in the field. And that can be important for lung and for liver. And it delivers both 3D conformal and IMRT. The Elekta Unity is similar to the ViewRay, except it does have a higher quality imaging. It's 1.5 T, which is a diagnostic quality. It doesn't yet facilitate gating, but I'm sure it will. It's a lot more expensive. And the beam actually goes through the magnet system. They haven't left a gap. So there is some scatter coming from the patient to worry about. And this is actually a view. The Elekta Unity is a magnificent machine. It basically is irradiating through an MR. The LINAC is on the outside, irradiating through a more or less conventional Philips MR system. 2 minutes? Good. So if we go and look at a conventional bunker for a C-arm gantry, the more classical one, the rooms are pretty big because the couches can kick over a long direction. And so it means you need large vaults. But you see that machines are being developed that are more like CT scanners. And so the couches can't move. They can't move laterally. And so you can put them in much smaller vaults. And if they go into much smaller vaults, then the construction costs are far reduced. I won't go into the details here, but one of the other reasons is important for radiation protection is that when you don't have the ability to kick the couch, it's much easier to put a beam stop in so that the primary beam is shielded. You don't have to worry about the shielding on the rooms. And you can also put in extra shielding in the covers. And basically, we did this with tomotherapy. We put in a lot more primary collimation, a lot thicker leaves, and a beam stop into the beam so that it was stopped. And Halcyon from Varian is essentially doing the same thing. And the footprint of the room is very, very small. And when you actually design the vaults for this, you can literally put in 2 machines in a classical vault now, and add shielding blocks inexpensively to get two vaults instead of 1. And interestingly, there's actually a self-shielded machine under development. In fact, two of them. This one's completed. This is the so-called, unbelievably, this is its name, ZapX. And the ZapX is designed for stereotactic radiosurgery. And it's self-shielded. You can go into a conventional room without shielding. Another system treats in an upright fashion. And this is, the upright radiotherapy has already been designed for carbon ions. It's also coming into protons. And the idea is if it's good enough for carbon ions and protons, why not conventional X-rays? This system is about the size of a Mini Cooper, and it's possible to shield this as well. The part that the patient's in is like a Europe, I won't call it an American elevator, it's a smaller elevator size like in Europe. And then proton gantry sizes are coming down. At least one of them is because of superconducting magnets on the gantry itself from the Pronova Corporation. So the take-home message is that modern radiotherapy is devoted to decreasing the acute exposure, the deterministic effects, the sensitive tissues, by actually being able to see what you're treating using CT scans for enabling 3D conformal and IMRT. Proton beams do reduce integral dose, and it's certainly important for pediatric patients. Image guidance using CT and MR assures that you can have small margins, which reduces the integral dose. And I think integral dose is a simple measure of patient harm that we should be adopting, and the radiation protection community should be adopting as well. The ring gantries are rivaling the old C-arm gantries that can treat from multiple directions, because coplanar fields with IMRT is all you really need. And vault sizes are being reduced, and there's an opportunity then to lower the cost of radiation therapy by having less expensive treatment solutions. Thank you very much.
Go ahead. We're going to switch over to the panel discussion, but maybe 1 or 2 questions, and I'm going to use the prerogative I have already being here to ask the question. Given the proliferation of protons, I do not understand why someone hasn't built an alpha particle machine. The advantages of spallation reduction, neutron reduction, track structure improvement are all enormous.
Yeah, well, I mean, the machines are more expensive.
Well, steel is a little more.
So the accelerators have to be about 4 times the energy. Synchrotrons, then it has a less impact, and carbon ions tend to be synchrotron-based, therefore. The gantries are bigger. In fact, the Heidelberg gantry is the size of a basketball court in size.
Yeah, but that's for carbon.
Well, yes, that's for carbon. It's it's somewhat smaller for helium, and I kind of agree with Anders Brahma that lithium or boron might be better than both.
Spallation is going to be a lot higher.
Well, carbon is worse. So
carbon is worse. But
yeah.
Beryllium and lithium they're low Z and they come unglued. Okay, any other questions? Not hardware crowd. Thank you, Rock.
Okay.
Yes, we still have one item on the agenda for today. It's late in the day. In Sweden, normally people go home after 4 o'clock, so I'm very happy to see so many still in the audience. So if you want to just stand up and, you know, loosen up a bit, that's fine. We will rig for the panel discussion. And then don't forget that at 5:30 up, one stair up, there is some sparkling wine for those who want to stay and continue chatting.